Hey guys, in this video we'll be going through how to build custom modal windows in Angular. I'll be using the code from this tutorial that I'll link to in the video description below. The tutorial is built in Angular 9, but the code we'll be building is compatible with any version from Angular 2, so it'll also run with Angular 8, 7, 6, etc. Before getting started, you should have your machine set up for developing Angular applications. If you don't, I'll provide a link in the video description to this tutorial, which goes through the steps for installing the tools you need. That includes Node.js and NPM, the Angular CLI, the Git CLI, and Visual Studio Code. There's also a link to that tutorial from the Modal tutorial down here. This is a demo of the custom modal functionality that we'll be building. It includes a simple button to open the modal. When the modal is open, it includes a semi-transparent background overlay and then the modal body on top of that. Modals can be closed via the button here or from clicking the background. A couple of other small details are if the modal is taller than the screen that it's in, it can be scrolled. And also when a modal window is open, the background scrolling of the background body is disabled. Most of the core modal functionality is controlled by a handful of CSS classes and a few lines of JavaScript for showing and hiding the modals. So I thought the best way to explain how they work and to show how they work would be to create a static HTML, CSS, and Vanilla.js version of them first, and then afterwards to create an Angular version which will wrap that functionality in an Angular component, service, and module. So the steps in this video that we'll be going through are first to create a static version, followed by an Angular version. Okay, let's get started. First thing we need to do is get the example code from this tutorial from GitHub. So jumping over to the GitHub link, clicking here to get the URL to the Git repo, and open your command window, cd into a directory where you want to store your projects. It can be any directory. I have a projects directory here, and enter the command git clone and paste the URL to the repo, and cd into that directory and enter the command code and the current directory path to open VS Code. Okay, there's our example project with the code that we'll be using to refer to for building our examples. Okay, jump back into your command window, cd back into the projects directory, and we'll make a directory for the static example that we'll create. And call it static modal example, and open that directory in VS Code by typing code and the path to that folder. And then create a HTML file for the static modal example. Just call it static modal.html, and enter a basic HTML page. Then open that file in a browser. Because it's a static file, you don't need to have a web server or anything running. You can just open it directly. And there's our static page working correctly. And jumping back to our example Angular 9 code. And then open up the modal component HTML in the Angular example. This is the basic HTML for the modal window. We'll be starting by adding the background overlay. You can copy that div, and then going back to our static example, pasting that there, and then going to the modal.component.less file and grabbing the modal background styles and pasting those in the style tag. The first set of styles here stretches the background across the entire screen. The second pair of styles here sets the background color to semi-transparent black. And the last style here sets the z-index, so the background sits above everything on the screen, and it's set to 900 because the z-index of the modal that we'll be putting on top of it is set to 1000. So we want the background to be above everything on the screen except for the modal that's going to go on top of it shortly. Saving that file, jumping back to the browser, hitting refresh, we can see that our background overlay is appearing correctly. Going back to the code in our example, the next markup that we want to get is the actual modal body div. Copy that, and back in our static HTML, paste that there. The ng content directive doesn't apply here because we're not in an Angular project, so I'll just put a paragraph with some body text. At the moment, if you refresh the page, there aren't any styles on it yet, so it's just appearing below the title as expected. Going back to the example, the less file, we grab the JW modal styles here, copy those, and back in our static HTML. Because this is CSS and not less, it doesn't support nesting, so we need to move this style out to the same level as the other styles. And the first set of styles here is the same as the background. It's position fixed and stretches the modal across the entire screen. The second style sets the z-index to 1000, which overlays it on top of everything, including the background, so it sits above the background. Overflow auto enables scrolling if the modal is longer than the screen. The JW modal body tag inside the modal container has a padding of 20 pixels and background of white, and a margin of 40 pixels, which allows us to see 40 pixels of the background overlay outside the edges of the modal. Now with that saved, go back to the browser and hit refresh. Okay, that's displaying correctly. As we can see, we've got our 40 pixels of margin outside of our modal, and background of white, and 20 pixels of padding inside. The last style to copy over from the example, which is easy to forget during development, is adding an overflow hidden property and a class to the body when a modal is open to prevent the background main body content from scrolling when the modal window is open. So normally if your background content is long and scrolls when your modal opens up, then the background will continue to scroll. To disable that, you set overflow hidden on the body, and to do that you can create a class that you add dynamically to the body tag when you open your modal. So going back to our static example, we can add that class. Now the next step is we want to have the modal hidden by default, and then to have a couple of buttons to show and hide the modal window using JavaScript. So we'll create a couple of functions, one for opening and one for closing the modal. In order to hide the modal and background with a single CSS style, I'll wrap it within a wrapper div and set that to display none by default. I'll also add an ID to this modal to make it easier to access via JavaScript. Setting display none on the wrapper. So back in the browser. That modal should now be hidden. Now in our code, within our open modal, we want to set display block on that wrapper div and add the JW modal open class to the body. To do that, we call document.getElementById. Style.display equals block. And to close the modal, set it back to none. And to add a class to the body, we call document.body.classlist.add. And then to remove, call remove. Lastly, for the static example, we want a couple of buttons for calling those functions to open and close the modal window. I think that should be everything. Let's test it out. Okay, that seems to be working. If we look in the browser DevTools, you can see that display is none on our div because I've just closed it. Body doesn't have a class of JW modal open. If I open the modal, that class is added, display is block, and closing is display none. Alright, now moving on to the Angular version. Going back to the command window, use the Angular CLI to create a new Angular project for our Angular modal example. We don't need routing, and we'll use less as the styles. Once that's created, cd into the project directory and open it in Visual Studio Code. By default, the CLI gives you a bunch of stuff, including an app component with this default code, which we don't need. So you can highlight all of that and remove it, replace it with this h1 tag. Go back to the command window and enter npm start to start the application. That's up and running now and listening on localhost 4200, so we'll go to that URL in our browser. Next, go back to Visual Studio Code and to our Angular 9 example project, and rather than creating each of these modal files manually in our new project, we can just copy the module folder over to our new project, and I'll go through each file and explain. So paste that in there and go through the code of each file and explain what each one is. Starting with the modal component, which you've already seen. That is the HTML for our modal windows. The ng content tag allows us to create modal windows from other components and inject custom content into this modal window. For example, when we add a component to our app component, we'll be able to use this modal tag and add content like this. And this p tag, this modal content, will be injected into the modal body via this ng content tag. I'll remove that now. We'll add it again shortly. In the less style sheet, you're already familiar with all of these styles which we created in our static example. The only difference is instead of the wrapper that we created, we're using the JW Modal tag, which is the component tag, which is effectively our wrapper when running in Angular. The modal component controls the opening and closing of the modal window. Up here we're defining the selector as the tag that we use for embedding modal windows as JW Modal. The template URL is modal component HTML. Style URLs to our list style sheet. This encapsulation property sets the styles to be global instead of being targeted specifically at this component. This is required to be able to target the component tag itself and also to be able to target the body tag, which is outside the scope of this component in Angular. That's why you need to have encapsulation set to none for that to work. Otherwise, the styles would need to be in the global styles.less. Next, we have an input ID string for setting the ID of the modal window, and a element property for accessing the DOM element of the modal for showing and hiding, and for also moving the modal element when the modal is initialized, which I'll show you in a moment. When the modal is initialized, it first checks to see that there is an ID property. It's required for showing and hiding modal windows, because when you try to open and close a modal in Angular, you pass the ID of which modal you want to open. So we need to have an ID to know which one we want to open. This line here where we append the element to the bottom of the body, that's also for ensuring that the modal window is displayed above everything on the page. If you have an Angular component, or if the modal element is nested somewhere within the DOM, it won't appear above everything else on the page necessarily, even if the z-index is set high. To ensure that it is above everything on the page, you need it to be at the root level, just within the body of the HTML document, which is the reason we have this appending the element just before the close body tag. This event listener here enables closing modal windows on background click. And finally here we have the modal component registering itself with the modal service. The modal service is what's used from other components within this Angular app for opening and closing modal windows. And the way the modal service knows or accesses which modals are currently in the application is via each modal registering itself with the modal service when it is initialized. On destroy, the modal component removes itself from the modal service to avoid memory leaks and removes its element from the DOM at the bottom of the screen. This is because it doesn't automatically get removed on destroy, because the element is now outside the scope of this component. And the open and close methods do exactly what we did in the static example, so you're already familiar with this code, where they set the style to block of the modal element and add the JW Modal Open class to the body tag, and the opposite for close. I'll jump to the modal service first before the module to show you how that works. So here you can see that the modal service maintains an array of all of the active modals that are currently within the application. The add and remove methods are called by each modal component when they are initialized and destroyed to register themselves and remove themselves from the modal service. The open and close methods are called from any component that wants to open or close a modal window and passing the ID of the modal that it wants to open or close. This enables any modal to be opened or closed from anywhere else, because all current modals within the application are within this array and are accessible via this service. Next, the modal module wraps the modal component and exports it, so any other module that wants to use the modal component can import the modal module, and then any other component within that module can use the modal component. Finally, we have the index.ts, which is a barrel file that simply re-exports the modal module and modal service, so they can be imported from other TypeScript files simply using the modal folder path instead of having to use the full path to the modal module or modal service. Okay, now that we've covered the modal module and component code, let's import the modal module into our app module for our example app. Adding that to the imports array. With that added to our app module, we now have access to the modal component from our app component. So we can add a JW modal like that. Within our app component, I'll add a constructor and inject an instance of the modal service. I'll make it public so it's accessible from the app component template as well. Save that. This modal service is now accessible from the app component template, and we can add a couple of buttons for opening and closing. One thing I've forgotten is to add an ID to the modal window. Then a close. And I think that is everything. There's our open modal button. Let's open the DevTools to see what's going on. Okay, we can see the class JW modal open. We can also see that our modal element has been appended to the bottom of the body as expected from the component code. We can click close modal, it's set display none, and it's hidden it from the page. We can also click the background to hide the modal there. Alright, I think that's everything. So those are all the pieces you need to build custom modal windows in Angular. I hope you enjoyed the video. Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like or subscribe below. Cheers.